Hello. I'd like to welcome you to the next installment of the Newsmaker interviews. Today we have with us Carlos Campo. He's the president of Ashland University and the chair of the Alliance for Hispanic Education. He's an educational consultant and works with national leaders in immigration reform. Prior to that, he served as president of Regent University in Virginia. Through the years, he has received many distinctions and awards, including Teacher of the Year and Who's Who in America's Teachers. He serves as a national spokesperson for educational issues within the Hispanic community. Please welcome Carlos Campo.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks.
I want to ask you about your parents, basically. I was just reading that your dad, a Cuban band leader,
That's right.
died 4 years ago at age 91.
Yes.
Tell us about him and what you learned from him.
Sure. You know, one of the things I've learned from Dad is that life is to be enjoyed. My father never missed a minute of joy in his life. You know, he also had a deep love for music, and that's something that's permeated my life as well. He never met a stranger, so I think that's one of the legacies that he's found in me. He was a person of faith as well, and so Dad's legacy is there as well. So I think those are all qualities that I try to carry on from that crazy Cuban who came to this country in 1940.
Okay, and then your mom was one of the Clooney sisters.
That's right.
Not Rosemary, but as I read this, tell me if this is accurate, that she and Rosemary Clooney recorded the hit song Sisters.
That's right.
From the movie White Christmas.
Yes.
She wasn't in the movie.
She was not. Vera Ellen was a much better dancer than my mother. So.
Okay. All right. And she died when you were 17.
That's right.
So what impact did that have on you?
It was really probably the formative event in my life. My mother was a great soul winner, and while she had a very close relationship with God her entire life, it was near the end of her life where she really took a much more personal relationship with Christ, brought myself, my sisters, many family members to know the Lord through her own witness. And her death was so sudden, she died from a cerebral hemorrhage, that it was deeply impactful. I was a young Christian at the time, and frankly, I couldn't reconcile a good God with this terrible act. But once I was able to work through that dark night of the soul, if you will, I feel like God has sort of embedded joy and optimism in my heart, which clearly comes from my faith. But that event really was striking and difficult, but I think has helped me understand with compassion when people are suffering for whatever reason.
How did you work through it? Because lots of people become bitter.
Exactly, and I think I could have, and of course it's God's grace, and it wasn't instantaneous. It took years for me to reconcile, and frankly, part of me began to see that it was selfishness, at least for me. I'm not saying that for others, but for me it became that, where I was mired in this depression, and I realized that I had a choice. I had a life to live, and I could continue to live it in this depressed state where I really wasn't achieving much, or I could try to pursue my destiny in Christ. And so the Lord helped me through that. And now I, of course, awaken with a sense of purpose. And frankly, I'm impervious to a lot of things I think that may get to other people because that suffering was so profound and deep. I don't feel like I can be touched in some ways by other suffering, and there's plenty to be had for all of us. So I feel like in a way it's been a gift to be able to work through that suffering.
Let me push you a little bit on the specifics of that. Okay. I mean, can you walk us through this process? I mean, it wasn't instantaneous.
It wasn't.
But what were some of the things that had an effect on you?
Well, clearly family was the primary effect. I had family who loved me enough to give me space and time to work through it, but also loved me enough to not let go and to continue to challenge me in Christ and to say, you do have a future, and we understand how you're feeling and the depth of your grief, but you can't live there, and you must work through that. So, and also pastors and friends in my life who nurtured me through that period. And I will say, as an educator, one of the things that I was able to do was hold on. I tell students all the time now that when you're in a some sort of a wreck? What sort of detritus is around you that you can hold on to? What is it in the rubble that's worth holding on to? And while I was going through this, I stayed in school. My grades, I don't want to tell you what my transcript looked like during those 2 years. They were not reflective of what I'd like to believe was my educational determination. But I didn't give up, and I stayed in school, and it was a lifeline for me. It was, in addition to my faith and family, education, and being in a climate where at least I knew I was doing something positive in my life helped as well.
So realizing this is a long process, was there a specific time when you turned the corner, in a sense?
There was. It wasn't a Pauline moment, but there was a time when I clearly said, and frankly felt as though the Lord and I had our final conversation about that topic, where I just said, okay, God, I get it, I understand. I'm not over it, but I'm not going to live there any longer. And while there have been plenty of times and deep disappointments in life, I really feel as though I've left it behind, and God's given me the grace to move on.
Okay. And while this happens, while this is developing, I mean, you're a teenager,
Right.
and then a young adult in Las Vegas.
Yes.
All sorts of ways to bury your sorrow in other things.
No question.
What kept you from doing that?
And I'd like to say that I was kept from that, but I wasn't, during that time fully. But I think once I did make that decision, I realized that all of those things were what they were. Frankly, one of the things that was most difficult about Las Vegas for me was, as a person of faith, I saw that it literally was built around the weakness of man. And I think that's very tough when a person who has perhaps an addiction to gambling cannot go, and you cannot go to a grocery store in Las Vegas without passing slot machines. They're in the lobby of every grocery store in town. And to me, that's very difficult. When you go and play a slot machine at a Las Vegas casino, you're given drinks for free. So if you have a drinking problem. So I think that's one of the things that was deeply troubling spiritually for me in Las Vegas. It's a place where sin abounds and grace abounds. There are many great Christian people there seeking God. But for me, because it really fed upon the weakness of mankind, there's something inherently dark about the city.
Are there churches that have slot machines in their lobbies?
Maybe so.
The church growth opportunity.
There you go. The church growth plan. Yeah. I did attend a church that met in a casino. Of course, they met in a convention area in the back. But I hadn't really thought about it. But I guess folks, congregants there had to suffer through the casino to get to them.
Yeah. And so then you go to University of Nevada.
That's right.
And you're majoring in literature, is that right?
That's right. Initially was a theater major, kind of wanting to follow in my parents' footsteps, and really enjoyed performing arts and was grateful for my life in the theater. And I met a professor named Christopher Hudgens, who's a scholar, wonderful man, who really said to me, Carlos, I think you have a career in academia and you should perhaps pursue English as a major. And that's when I did take on a master's degree in English and used the background that I developed in theater as I continued to study English.
And your dad during this time is still working as a band leader, basically?
He is.
In Las Vegas?
That's right. So
but not like Ricky Ricardo.
Very, very much like him. As a matter of
Really?
fact, my father, when he came to the States, he had been courted, if you will, by a club owner in New York City. He was in Havana and asked my dad to come to New York City if he were ever there to look him up. Well, as the Lord would have it, Desi Arnaz was actually the headliner that night, and he was introduced to my father, and again, this is in 1940, and they were lifelong friends. And so my father actually did pattern his career in many ways around Desi, and so in the same fashion that Desi really led with his personality, my dad did that as well.
Okay. And then you stay at University of Nevada. I mean, you must have liked it because you undergraduate, master's, PhD,
Yes,
and so forth, and then professor.
that's right.
Okay, so what's the? And again, there is this thing in academia that, well, you should not be teaching at the same place where you studied. You broke that informal rule.
Right.
And would you recommend that for others?
Well, I think you have to judge for yourself. For me, I had such a deep commitment to that community. And as I found this transition from being in the student body to teaching that student body, I saw that I had an advantage there to really understand their milieu in ways that I wouldn't have. being from the outside. So that was certainly one thing. But my mother's death, as I referred to earlier, it really made our family come together in a way that said, we're going to stay together. And frankly, the only university within a 200-mile radius of Las Vegas is UNLV. And so that was part of that commitment as well. We had other opportunities, but really felt that faith and family came first before occupation. And so it's one of the reasons we continued to stay there for quite some time.
Okay. And let me ask, did you, your dad actually set up a jazz club within Caesar's Palace. So,
Yes.
so you were very familiar with all the casinos and so forth. Did you ever indulge in that?
Yes, gaming had some enticement for me as well. I'm grateful to say I was never addicted to it, but there was this sort of daring that's inherent in the game. So 21 was a game that was my favorite, and played it too much, and was successful enough to think I had a chance to win. You
didn't finance your college education through that,
I wish
though.
I could say that. I guess I could have shifted to poker and done that if I had any talent in that area, but it wasn't in my cards. Sorry.
Okay. And then you, still staying in Las Vegas, you became dean and chief academic officer at College of Southern Nevada.
That's right.
So what led you to go from professorship into administration?
I had been working for a number of years in the English department and teaching these gatekeeper classes, and really seeing many students, particularly minority students, failing to have the skill set to perform well in those classes. And when I had the opportunity to go into administration, I saw that perhaps I could, from an administrative point of view, create practices and policies that could help those students be more effective in ways that as an English professor I couldn't.
Okay. Now, Nevada right now is the state which probably has the most interesting experiment in K through 12 education, from what I've read, concerning. Well, can you tell us about that and what you think about it?
Well, I think Nevada is on its way to experimentation, partially because they have failed so much in the past. And one of the things that we've talked often about is that, Nevadan students in college and university graduated under 36% in 6 years. So I think Nevada saw that they needed to reform their practices and take on some opportunities that you would perhaps see in charter schools otherwise. So Nevada really has become much more creative in the way they're reaching out to students and trying to develop these competencies within the student body.
And as I understand it, starting this fall, everyone in Nevada can get, in essence, a voucher and use it for a public school, a private school, for distance education, for anything, right? Is that?
It is if you look at school choice, it has become the gold standard for school choice. And I think what they're hoping to do through this system is challenge the school systems wherever they exist, and letting the marketplace really shape what they hope is a better future for Nevada students.
Okay, so there seem to be two different approaches to trying to improve educational experience for students. One emphasizing choice, and thus variety and diversity, and then the other, Common Core, emphasizing, in fact, national standards and testing for those standards. Are those two diametrically opposite?
I don't think so. And I think even hearing you say national standards, when we talk about Common Core, we often forget that the title actually is Common Core State Standards. Okay. But because the federal government did incentivize those standards to be adopted by states, very often we conflate them as federal standards. And I think as Christian people, and I think as conservatives, we're very concerned when we see the federal government involved in education at all. But I think the standards themselves are very positive and have the opportunity to blend in any of the systems that we've described and be very effective.
But don't those become national standards because a lot of states do adopt them pretty much on that national basis? Then testing reflects those, and teachers tend to teach to the test. So while they're called, while the name state is in there, in reality really isn't. It seems to be imposing a national standard. What do I have wrong in being concerned about that?
Well, I think a couple of things. One, many more states adopted these state standards than I think the initial team and group that worked on these, including state educational experts, really anticipated. So there was such a rush, an influx of states adopting them, that it seemed as though the federal government must have instituted it. In truth, even though the federal government incentivized the adoption of these state standards, many states didn't adopt them and still haven't, Virginia being one, right? So the state where we sit didn't adopt the standards. They still felt, Virginia still feels as though their standards are superior to these standards. So I think that part of what the issue is if the standard is something like a ninth grader must be able to proficiently complete polynomials, that's not a political issue. And if that standard were a state, federal, or other standard, we would see it as a legitimate standard.
Okay. Come back to this in a moment, but just continuing to trace your career.
Sure.
Pat Robertson beckoned and took you away from Nevada, and you became the provost at Regent.
That's right. And of course, I would amend your statement only to say that it was God who beckoned and Pat was his vehicle, but that's
Although
right.
sometimes he might confuse. Never mind. Won't go there.
Just for the record, that was Professor Olasky and not Dr. Campo who said that.
So, but what was the real incentive for you to go leave Nevada
Right.
east?
Well, and it truly was a calling, but I will say that our children began attending faith-based institutions. My son went to Westmont College, a school I know you know well in Santa Barbara area, and we had never been exposed to Christian education before. It's interesting because, of course, Christian would not be a needed modifier for education not that many years ago, right? But for me, it was a revelation to see that there were places where folks were overtly focusing on this intermingling of faith and practice, which to me was fascinating. And the moment we stepped on the campus at Westmont, I thought to myself, Lord, this would be a remarkable way, almost the fullest expression of what it means to be an educator, at least from my perspective. So when we had the opportunity at Regent, we're delighted to be a part of that.
Okay, and you lived happily ever after there.
Well, I don't know much about fairy tales, but it lasted for 7 years, and it was a remarkable time.
Okay, and then you resigned suddenly in September 2013.
Yes,
Just after the academic year began.
that's right.
And I guess the suddenness of it attracted a lot of interest.
That's right, and I think the suddenness is always in the eye of the beholder. I think that a lot of us realize that a transition like that isn't unusual, and frankly wasn't unusual there at Regent. It had happened a number of times before, and so while it may have seemed sudden to others, in truth, it was part of a natural progression, I think.
Right. So you were provost then president, and sometimes it seems it's hard for the founder of an institution who's been president of it and leading it to give that up.
Right, and I think one of the things you'd find for most founders is they have a deep love for that institution. And I think that's one of the things you would find about Dr. Robertson. He loved and loves Regent. He wants it to be right. He wants it to be particularly right from his perspective. And I really admired that in him, his deep love for the institution and his desire to see it succeed.
Okay, so that then gave you the opportunity to become an educational consultant for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which has been very much involved in promoting Common Core.
Yes.
So is that when you became very much involved in the Common Core debate?
We had discussions about higher standards for many years. I was part of the American Diploma Project when I was working at a state institution in Nevada. And so it was during that time when I was very interested in common assessments for students, no matter what their background, no matter their zip code, no matter their ethnicity, educational or economic background.
Seems to be a lot of opposition to Common Core among evangelicals. Why do you think that is?
It's interesting because if you track Common Core as long as I have and been a part of the system and the system of assessing standards, it really wasn't true early on. Even early on in the adoption of Common Core, there was no outcry, there was no opposition really. As you probably know, states like Kentucky adopted them early on. Huge evangelical community there didn't really see it as problematic. And unfortunately, I believe that the standards became conflated with a number of things, including a political stance that really had very little to do with the standards, very much to do with very right-thinking individuals with very right thoughts about the intermingling of the federal government in particular and education, and the standards themselves became lost in this broader discussion.
So what do you think about that intermingling of the federal government and education?
It is anathema to me to see the federal government involved in education. I mean, many of us have read A Nation at Risk. It was published in 1983, and we at that time said our nation was at risk because of the declension that we have suffered in education, and yet we have done nothing to improve education in all that time, despite the best efforts of the Department of Education, the billions of dollars that we've spent. But even in all of that, education in America still has been state-run. So even with states developing educational plans, it's rare to see a state succeed in terms of the national advancement of education in our country. So I oppose the federal government being involved. It needs to be at the local level. Parents, PTAs, great teachers need to be involved, especially in the development of curriculum. I think we all agree that we want experts developing standards. We want experts developing curriculum. We don't want Uncle Sam doing that.
Right, but how does it work if there are experts developing curriculum and there are national standards that are set up, which then states can agree to uphold or not on a voluntary basis, but a lot of them start doing that, and then the tests reflect that? Doesn't that put huge pressure on other states to get involved and forget their local emphasis, but go with the national flow?
I think that states can forget that, but I don't think the standards in and of themselves drive that. I think it's been the political discussion that has. I often take people back to Wordsworth's great poem that is entitled "Nuns Fret Not at Their Convent Walls," okay, because I think it's clear that one of the things that Wordsworth is expressing there, not just about nuns and convents, but of course the framework for the sonnet. In his mind, it's a framework, and actually it's a framework that allows for creation and doesn't inhibit it. And I think great standards do the same, so that they don't drive curriculum. Even the tests that would be aligned to a standard, like use a thesis statement effectively in a sentence. For gracious sakes, there's nothing constraining about that. Just the opposite. Every classroom must have a standard. Every teacher must use standards. I think these standards are outstanding. They've been aligned against some of the toughest standards worldwide. And while there has been such poor work and little traction in terms of education reform, this to me has been the brightest spot, an attempt to raise standards for all students, to hold teachers accountable, to allow students to say, I'm no longer going to be socially promoted, but I'm moving on to the 4th grade because I have proficiency in 3rd grade math and reading. These are revolutionary.
So agreed that it's essential for students to have proficiency in 3rd grade math and reading in order to move to the 4th grade. One criticism, there are a lot of criticisms, of course, that various teachers and others put forward on this. One is that with that emphasis, that test-mandated, demanded emphasis on reading and math, and in fact their jobs on the line if their scores don't improve and the school on the line, that other things that are important and can actually lead to a disciplined life, such as music and art and learning history and so forth, those types of things tend to get put on the back burner just because the tests are so crucial.
Well, I think the fact that music and the arts have been on the decline for a number of years really is not related to Common Core. As states have had to contract, they have decided what they believe is relevant education and that which is not relevant. And as an English lit specialist, you know where I stand in all of this. I think when King Lear said reason, not the need, to one of his treacherous daughters who was wanting to reduce his retinue, I would say the same thing to educators who believe they're doing the right thing by cutting music and theater and other arts programs. So I would suggest that our students are over-tested, no question. And I would suggest that state assessments have been so poor, Professor Olaski, you know well, that there's been an honesty gap. It's existed here in Virginia and other states. You know, the national assessment of educational progress, this nation's report card, I beckon our students and others to go to that report card and see this gap between what states are reporting and where students really are testing. To think that our student body is 36% proficient basically in reading and math, right, by the 8th grade, and then we see that decline by 10 percentage points, so that in the 12th grade, only 25% of 12th grade students are proficient in mathematics. To me, that's a travesty. And Common Core state standards give us the opportunity to elevate that proficiency level across the board. We have, I believe, exposed this honesty gap through those standards. The standards don't drive curriculum. And shame on any teacher who feels as though they have to succumb to some test or some pressure to create curriculum that is somehow uniform, because there's nothing in a standard that says use a thesis statement effectively that dictates what you should read, how you should interpret. All of those things are still left up to the local districts.
Right now, of course, you do have, I appreciate very much the literary references you make, and I'll make an historical reference where the King of England says to his knights in regard to Thomas à Becket, you know, won't anyone rid me of this quarrelsome priest? And he's not telling them to kill him, but they understand that, and doesn't that tend to work in some ways when you impose these tests?
You know, I favor the reduction of tests. Folks have said we have to quit teaching to the test. And what I would say is, well, I want to know what the test is first.
Okay.
Right? If you have the right test and you don't offer too many of them, I'm all in favor. There has to be a backstop. There has to be a way to assess. So the right kind of test is right. But if we believe that education is the intentional transmission of a culture's accumulated knowledge, its skills, and its values, let's create a test that encompasses all three. That's what I have deep concerns about, because I think we've left that third piece off. And that's one of the things I think is incumbent upon state leaders, faith leaders, and others to ensure that it's not just one person or 10 people's version of what that accumulated knowledge should be, or those skills should be, or most importantly to me, what those values should be.
Okay. Let me ask about another thing you started doing when you left Regent. You became chair of the Alliance for Hispanic Education.
Yes.
For the National Hispanic Christian Leadership Conference. How does you've been making, I think, very articulate comments about the educational process as a whole. Now let's relate it to the particular needs of the Hispanic population.
Well, I think it's clear that Hispanic students have struggled for years to keep up. And part of this is a language competency, but that's not the only issue. Poverty is another issue. Many Hispanics find them in the lowest quintile in the U.S. The most impoverished area in the United States is actually just outside of New York City, an area you know pretty well. And an area that has not progressed for years and years and years. And educational studies show that it's very difficult for that lowest quintile to move out of that position if they don't have a college degree. Their chances of moving out almost are equated to a caste system. So what are those needs? One of the things that's clear is standards, but also great instructors. We have seen that urban blight has led to the worst instructors sitting in classrooms in front of students who need help the most. Students who don't have families that are intact, whose safest place perhaps that entire day is that classroom experience. They have nutritional and other deep needs. And that's true for many Hispanic students as well. So it's not a single factor, and I think that's what we're trying to express to folks. Standards aren't a panacea. They're a place to start, but there are many other issues that have to be addressed as well for Hispanic students and minority students in general.
Let me ask you about two places where there are interesting and important experiments going on. First, in Nevada.
Yes.
Tell us about that. And the percentage of Hispanic students in Nevada schools are about what? You
know, in kindergartens in Nevada today, the Hispanic students are somewhere around 75%. Overall, I think it's closer to about 35%.
Okay. So what's Nevada trying to do?
You know, Nevada's trying to open to the marketplace the school choice for one. They're working very hard on charter schools that have models that have been successful. One of the other programs that I applaud Nevada is that they are, and see how I even pronounce the word. If you go to the website in Nevada, you would find that they are quick to tell us we're mispronouncing it when we use the Spanish pronunciation. and say Nevada or snow fallen.
What did?
Nevada. As a matter of fact, you say no to that. Well, don't go to Nevada because they will correct you instantly, as they did former President Bush when he pronounced it Nevada. All of that to say, one of the programs I applaud is they are fostering educational leaders very young. So they're identifying students even as early as in the 8th grade, and then as they approach the 9th grade, students who are predisposed to be teachers, they're actually having their education paid for when they get into college and university life, and then they pay that back by working as teachers. And they're particularly targeting minority students and Hispanic students because there's a lot of research that is linked to what is called like me leadership, so that when students of any background see someone who looks like them, has a similar background perhaps, even a similar name. A phenomenon that I saw when I was teaching in Nevada was that many Hispanic students were in my classroom. I mean, 9 out of 10 students in my classroom were Hispanics, and that didn't reflect the demography. And I began querying students, and they said, we came because we saw your name. We saw Campo in the course catalog, and so we came thinking that perhaps there was a connection here.
Okay. And Nevada this fall is also really implementing parental choice, right?
That's right.
How does that work?
Well, they allow Nevada parents to have a voucher that they can use to choose to educate their student at home, as we did for all 3 of our kids at some point in their educational career, or choose a charter school, a school of faith. So even faith-based schools, these vouchers can be used. So this is revolutionary, and we actually favor this system. But I will say there should be this caveat. We need more information available for families about those schools. Schools still are notorious in keeping information about student outcomes from parents. So one of the things we are saying to Nevada parents and grandparents and to educators, please make this information accessible for parents so that they're aware of how their students can succeed at your institution.
Okay. Let's go about 3,000 miles east, Miami.
Yes.
What's going on there?
You know, in Dade County for years, there have been programs that actually take what they see as the advantage of having Spanish-speaking young people in the classroom and blending it in a classroom that doesn't say it has to be English only, but instead it says to English-speaking students, you can learn a second language, and it says to Spanish-speaking students, you can as well, so that instructors find ways and work with experts in the classroom to capitalize on a rich and diverse linguistic environment, so that we find that Dade County students perform remarkably well both in Spanish and in English as a result.
So the students who grew up speaking Spanish, by the time they get to college, their proficiency in English is what?
It far exceeds what you would find as the national average for Hispanic students, and even the average for any student. If you were to take the students who are studying in the Southwest and compare them to Dade County students, it's stunning to see, as those students are faced with English-only classrooms, how they struggle and struggle and struggle. And even those Spanish speakers who are shielded from speaking English and they will never achieve English proficiency in the same way as students who are forced to in ways that are blended in an environment like happened in Dade County.
Okay, and then the English language, the students who grew up in English language,
yes,
then really become bilingual, not just knowing a few swear words, but actually able to.
That's right. They're able to do quite well. And as a matter of fact, we found that those students who stay with it, especially those who stay in that geographic area, have the facility to use that language very often, and they become bilingual speakers throughout their lives.
Okay. Let me also ask you about the National Hispanic Education Sunday, which I guess just this past Sunday, was that it?
As a matter of fact, we did celebrate it last Sunday, but most of the pastors and others who are celebrating education are taking the entire month of September. So what we found, and you know it well, being in these circles for so long, there has been an artificial divide that has kept the church and education separate. And that's been true in a number of circles, and I would suggest probably It is more prevalent in Hispanic communities. Hispanic people of faith very often are Pentecostals. You'll see this a lot. Even Hispanics who start in the high church, perhaps, very often they will convert into a Pentecostal tradition. And Pentecostalism and education have had this false divide for years and years. What we're trying to do is tear down those walls between Pentecostals, evangelicals more broadly, and education. And so we've asked pastors, many of whom have been reluctant to speak from the pulpit in favor of education. Frankly, many of them in the pulpit saying, don't send your child to college or university because it's the breeding ground for apostasy. Now we're saying stand in that pulpit and say there is a place like Patrick Henry College to send your child, like Ashland University, where your child's foundation won't be sledgehammered into oblivion, but instead they will find people who are like-minded, who will nurture them and help them find their destiny. So that's what National Hispanics Education Sunday is all about. And let me alert your listeners to our website, only because of the resources that are available there in Spanish and in English. It's nhclc.org. That's nhclc.org. And there you'll find tremendous resources available in English and in Spanish for parents and students to help them be more successful.
Okay, and I read that there's a Beca in Bibles program, Beca meaning scholarship in Spanish.
That's right.
How does that work?
What we do is when that child is dedicated to the Lord as an infant, that we hand them a Bible and a college scholarship. We feel like it is this investment in their future. And while we will always say that we are leading with Scripture, because we know what it profits a man or woman if they gain all and lose their soul, we also want that child to see that there is no separation between faith and learning, so that that child has an investment, as it were, in their future. So what we have asked is that every church will take a love offering for every child. You know, you can start for as little as $200. You can start a college scholarship program for that child in almost every state. And it's a tax-free account that can be set up in that child's name. And more than that, it gives that child an expectation. What we found, every research indicates that if you anticipate and expect that child will succeed, that child has a much better chance of success. And so what we believe that Becca's and Bibles program does is it gives that child this sort of literal opportunity to see themselves as a college student and one who can succeed.
Okay. We'll go to your questions in just a moment. One last question from me now,
Please.
Of course. Political year. Two very obviously Hispanic candidates
Yes.
running, Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio. Republicans talking about, well, how are Republicans going to get more of the Hispanic vote? If you were brought in as a consultant for one of these campaigns, and you may very well be, I don't know, but if you were, what would you advise?
I would advise conservatives to focus more on that which unifies the Hispanic community. And you're not going to be surprised to hear me say I would lead with things like faith and education. I think that that's one area where the two candidates to whom you referred, they have led with a faith discussion in some ways, but I haven't heard enough about education. And I would suggest that conservative candidates across the board should take a page out of Ronald Reagan's book, who said that every Hispanic is a Republican. They just don't know it yet, because he saw that in conservative values, they align so well with so many Hispanics who are hardworking, who believe in family and faith. Those are values that are shared by Hispanics of every stripe, every tribe and tongue, if you will. So that's where I would say Hispanic Republican leaders, conservative leaders should lead as they discuss in Hispanic communities their platforms, their views about America. Conservative ideas are either better or they're not. We believe deeply that they are better. And you would be stunned, or perhaps not, to know, Hispanic people have seen the failure of liberal ideologues in almost every Latin American country. It's frankly one of the reasons why Hispanics don't turn out to vote. Many adult Hispanics who don't turn out to vote, they don't turn out because they know what it has meant in their home country. It's meant nothing. The other thing is Hispanics are very young in America, and we have done a very poor job educating young Latinos about the importance of voting. So that's another thing that I would say to to any Republican hopeful, get to those young people, come to our campuses, go to any urban center in America, to the community colleges, to private schools, to public ones, faith-based schools and others, and say to those young Latinos, you have a vote in America's destiny and its future. Because more and more we know that the Hispanic vote is going to matter. Maybe not so much in 2016, but in 2020 moving forward, it's going to be the deciding vote.
So a lot of pundits and consultants are saying to Republican candidates, well, you have to lead with immigration and adopt position X or else you're dead in the water. You're saying something different, it sounds like.
It's a mistake. It's a mistake. If you lead with education, if you lead with family, if you lead with faith, there's no question that the tenor of your discussion regarding immigration is important. I would suggest that is true for Latinos and non-Latinos alike. But it's not the substance as much as it is the tenor. People want to see that you're a compassionate human being. And if you're not compassionate, I think they're going to be mistrustful of you no matter what your political stripe.
Okay. Questions? Could be questions on Hispanic education, questions on Common Core, or questions about the difference between Ashland University Regent and the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Yeah, Les, go ahead.
Hi, thanks for coming.
Yes, thank you.
What do you think school districts should do to better identify who's going to make a good teacher, and how should our culture or our education establishment promote the training of good teachers?
What a great question. I think one of the things we need to do is elevate teaching as a discipline and as a career. We have lost the deep respect we had for educators, and it literally in my generation, literally in that, at least from my perspective, short period of time. When I even first came to college, it was not unusual for us to stand when a professor walked into the room. We had that sort of belief in the dignified nature of the work that they were doing, because who is that person? Who are the people who are translating this cultural dynamic, especially the cultural value, from one generation to the next? And as we know, in many countries, that is still the case. So I often hold up Finland as an example. I wouldn't want to follow the Finnish model fully, but one of the things that Finland did is they became very serious about who could even apply to graduate school to be an educator. So you had to finish in the top 20% of standardized testing to even apply to be in an education school. I'm not advocating that for America, but I would suggest we have to be a little bit more selective in who can apply to be an educator. But I think more importantly, and your question seemed to imply that you're moving in this direction, I think it's exactly the right way to go, and that is we have to demand more of educational programs. Folks, we all know there's a spectrum out there of educational programs, and the poorest educational programs in this country are so poor that students who are getting a degree from those institutions should never be standing in front of students. And for us to continue to protect any educator who is standing in front of a student, to me, is absolutely striking at the very heart and foundation of our country. You know, who would ever take their car to a brake specialist who says they get it right half the time? You know, I get the brakes right about half the time. Is that okay? I mean, who would ever say, I'm going to pay? The greatest investment we make in our lives is in our college education. And yet, nationally, we're graduating 55% of our students. So we have to demand more from our schools of education. We have to, I would suggest that we have to crowdsource better than we do now. We crowdsource in ways that we don't for teachers. I know very few universities, I'm looking out at students right here at Patrick Henry, I know very few universities who have public fora when they bring prospective teachers onto campus. And this should be true for high schools and other formats as well, where students should have a say in who stands before them. Student evaluations of testing mean almost nothing at colleges and universities and other settings as well. They mean almost nothing for tenure, for promotion in school after school. We have to change that paradigm, and those are some of the ways we have to begin.
I'm sorry, and just briefly, if a school district wants to hire the best teachers, they got a pool of 25 or 30 candidates, whatever it is, how does a school figure out who is the good teacher?
Well, and I think there are a number of researched ways to do that. And I think great teachers do several things. Great teachers understand that teaching is science and an art. Great teachers understand that you cannot treat every child the same. You can't. You must have standards for every child, but every child is an individual. And I would of course suggest a created individual with a particular destiny. So, but here's what research says, that a teacher who doesn't believe that every child has the ability to succeed should not be teaching. So that's another area where instructors should be evaluated and tested. And third, we should do far more on the front end to identify those with the facility for teaching, and then of course continue to track their teaching and have very clear consequences for teachers who are failing in the classroom.
Thank you so much for coming, Mr. Campo. I'm curious whether you think the Chicano movement has had an influence on Hispanic education, the Chicano movement being the focus on bilingual and biculturalism amongst Hispanic Americans, whether they would support the Common Core state standards or whether they would see them as culturally restrictive.
Well, it's a great question. And when you talk about the Chicano movement, there are some who would understand fully what that meant and understand it in a context. The term Chicano very often can mean someone of Mexican heritage, right? Mexican-American heritage. I've been using these terms Hispanic and Latino interchangeably. There are some who would say that's not correct, that the term Hispanic, especially because it was a government term initially, right? And contains the basis, I guess, in some ways for a word spic, and I'm sorry to say that word, but it is a word that comes from that term. I'm aware of all those things, and yet for me, I use those terms interchangeably because it is very typical. I hate, frankly, hate's a strong word. I don't like labels. I don't, especially as a person of faith. I know that God sees me through a lens that is not defined by my ethnicity. As a matter of fact, He has created me with part of Him in us. So this eternal quality that transcends place and ethnicity and all of that. So I will say that here's what I think is wonderful about the wonderful part of the Chicano movement is it gives folks a sense of identity and pride, right? In an area where very often they're devalued, right? So my difference is often seen as a negative. The Chicano movement has said, take that difference and make it a point of pride. But my Chicano brothers and sisters who are the most radical, I think, are those who would say, shame on American people for telling me to go back to where I came from, because this is where I came from, right? They should go back to where they come from. How can they call me a wetback when I just crossed a little river and they crossed a wide ocean to come to my land? This is my land. Those kinds of discussions are divisive, and I don't favor those. And so I would suggest that there are some in the Chicano movement who would see value in the Common Core state standards, because they would say they are irrespective of origin and culture, and they transcend those boundaries. But I know that there are some in the Chicano movement who would have the same reservations that I do about the federal government becoming involved in educating our students. So I would suggest that this is played out in a number of ways. I think you can tell from my temperament and personality that I want to find ways to bring people together. I think it's what Jesus did. He literally gave his life on a cross that has become, for me, and even in the NHCLC, this emblem of the horizontal and the vertical. And to me, if we get the vertical right, our relationship to God, we have to get the horizontal right as well. We are called through this relationship with God to a horizontal relationship with our brothers. And those, to me, that I value most in the Chicano movement, they've seen that. They want to reach through culture to their brothers and sisters and not create a dividing line. So thank you for the question. Thank you for the sentiment.
How do you deal with the tension between the Chicano movement and Cuban ancestry?
Right. Well, I think to me, the tension dissolves when we find those places, those points of intersection. And that's what I've tried to do. Not always successfully, but that's what I've tried to do. I remember once being in a setting where someone said, your Cuban ancestry doesn't count as being a Hispanic or Latino because you're one of those good Hispanics. You've had privilege, and I have personally had privilege in my life, but to me, again, that's a divisive approach. And what unites us, of course, I think Ben Carson said it beautifully, and he's a brain surgeon. And so he sees the inherent qualities that unite us when he delves into someone's brain that isn't black or white, Hispanic, African American, or otherwise. And I would suggest that God has put something in my heart for the Latino people. I believe that the Lord did that. And I hope to transcend, these boundaries that would say, oh, so you're advocating for Hispanics and not for others. So you're one of those who sees a lens for Hispanics first and then others. That's not true. God has given me a special love for Latino students. That is mine. That is true. But it is not ever to the exclusion of other students. They're all children of God.
Thank you so much, Mr. Campo, for coming. You kind of speak about uniting peoples together. So I want to ask you, as Latino conservatives, how do we come together and discuss immigration reform, both with Latinos who stand on the side of believing that the liberal agenda is what's going to get them true reform, but also understanding that as conservatives, we can promote that as well?
That's a great question, and it's one of the wonderful things. It's been very difficult being a conservative Christian and favoring things like state standards. It's been very difficult being a conservative and a Christian and favoring comprehensive immigration reform. But it's been very wonderful because it's brought me into rooms and discussions with people with whom I share almost nothing else in common. But I'm able to bring my faith into the discussion in not a way, hopefully, that is an attempt to wear my Christianity on my sleeve, which I don't think is the way of Christ. But I believe that when people hear a reasoned, rational, faith-leading conversation about compassion, about why we believe in redemption, and that there was a year of Jubilee that Christ certainly believed in. He referenced it often. So I believe that a year of Jubilee is part and parcel to a political and a policy agenda and a way to begin that discussion that leads with compassion and not with policy and politics. So I guess that's, to me, a bridge. And that's the way I would begin those conversations. And I would like to go on to add that I think one of the difficult things for me is we have not had that compassion very often in these discussions. And it's very difficult for me as a Christ lover, as someone who loves Jesus, as someone who knows him to be one who loved indiscriminately, to be now pigeonholed as a bigot, as well, all the things that we often are. So that's the way I try to begin those conversations. And frankly, it has, I think, led to a broadening of those discussions. And my hope is that more conservative leaders would understand that if you understand true compassion, there has to be a way to deal with the realities of where we are without sacrificing deeply held beliefs. Thank you. Thanks.
Let me ask you a question about the future of Christian higher education, and maybe I'll tie it to Ashland. If a professor were applying for a job at Ashland and he's qualified academically, but he is either living in an openly adulterous heterosexual relationship or a homosexual relationship, would you hire that professor?
Unfortunately, and it's very difficult to compartmentalize human beings in those ways, but I think that because we are clearly a university with a Christian tradition and a campus creed that would be at odds with that lifestyle, it would be very difficult for us to justify the hiring of that person. But I think the question really gets at this deeper issue. The deeper issue is, where does Christ stand in these crossroads in all of these discussions? And it's very difficult for me because I know that the Lord sees me for all of who I am. And I know that he sees me in my sin, washed of that sin because of his sacrifice. And I hope that we can turn these discussions, because they've become so focused on issues of gender identification and so focused on issues of sexuality. When I think of myself broadly as a human being, And I think we've magnified these issues to the extent where we can almost not have any other conversation. So all that to say, Christian higher education is in a very difficult place. And to me, it's very unfortunate. I remember being a young person and going to Catholic school and being in classrooms with kids of no faith, other faiths, and their parents were sending their children to this school, not because of the catechism that was taught, but because it was a great school. So I'd like to believe that Christian schools, and from my perspective, they should drop that modifier. I don't think they should need to say that. I've never read at Cal Berkeley, and forgive me, they're often categorized as a very liberal school. I don't think Cal Berkeley says, we're the most liberal, secularized institution in the country. Why should Patrick Henry have to say that they're a Christian college? They stand for Jesus. They stand for Jesus. They stand for truth. As a matter of fact, they are compelled to teach the truth, I would suggest, in ways that other institutions are not compelled to teach the truth. You must teach the truth, and compelled by the individual who said he was the truth to teach that truth in an unbiased fashion in ways that other institutions aren't. So I would hope that we could throw off those labels and let students decide where they'd want to go to school, and let them decide which institution is compelled to teach the truth and teaches it best.
So, no, I agree with you that there's too much emphasis on sexuality as if that's the only question of importance. Nevertheless, there is, and as president of Ashland, and you're new in that position, but I would be very surprised if this doesn't come up within the next year or two. And so what would your position be on that hiring question?
Well, the institution was founded by the Brethren in 1878, and the Brethren tradition continues to be that traditional marriage between a man and a woman is one that we should foster in our culture if we are going to see a culture move forward. And that Brethren tradition continues to be upheld at Ashland University, and I know that the board feels very strongly. 51% of our board is in that tradition. The board recently followed the ruling, I think it was 2 years ago, that the Brethren Church released a statement regarding human sexuality, and they upheld that marriage between a man and a woman is a traditional view of marriage, and they also upheld that a biblical view of sexuality must be one that is encountered in marriage and in a marriage between a man and a woman.
Okay, so let's say that situation arose, Ashland did not hire, let's say, an active homosexual,
Right.
and the college is sued, the university is sued, plus at some point, depending on who's in power, the Department of Education, the IRS come down on you hard. What then? Are you prepared for that?
Well, I believe that our board is prepared for that. I think any institution that holds to its values, whatever those values be, there are certain values that are transcendent and cannot be compromised. And I would suggest that the board has a tradition of standing for those values and will continue to in the future.
Okay, and just playing it one more move down the road here.
Yes.
If at that point the federal government cuts off Ashland University and lots of others
Sure.
from student aid, fellowships, loans, and so forth, what then?
Well, I don't think, as I said, I don't think values can ever be compromised. So no matter how high the stakes are raised, I don't think the values can be changed, because at what point, right, do you ask yourself, are you no longer Ashland, right? Are you no longer Patrick Henry? So I think at some point, if you're going to retain who you are as an institution, it really doesn't matter what the stakes are. It matters what you stand for.
Other questions right now? Well, let me ask one last one then. That you've been married for 35 years, is that right?
I have, through God's grace.
Through God's grace.
Yes.
That's the way I feel about our 39 years. I can tell you the next 4 years are just going to be fantastic.
Oh, great.
But do you sing to your wife at night?
Almost every night. No, not often, but every once in a while I croon a tune.
And what do you croon?
It has to be a lullaby, something about how much I love her, of course.
Okay.
An Irish lullaby
Irish
with
lullaby.
a little Latin flair.
All right. All right. Well, please join me in thanking Dr. Campo for coming here today.
Thank you. Thank you for the discussion. Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Thank you.
And tonight, 6 p.m., maybe up there, Michael Franzisi, former mafioso, now a follower of Christ.
That's what it's staying for.